Chapter 14 Fire and Water. Now if you wish, like dwarves, to hear news of Smaug, you must go back again to the evening when he smashed the door and flew off in a rage. 2 nights before. The men of the lake down Esgaroth were mostly indoors, for the breeze was far from the black east and chill, but a few were walking on the quays and watching, as they were fond of doing, the stars shine out from the smooth patches of the lake as they opened in the sky. From their town, the lonely mountain was mostly screened by low hills in the far end of the lake, though a gap in which the running river came down from the north. Only its high peak could be seen in the clear weather, and they seldom looked at it, for it was ominous and drear, even in the light of the morning. Now it was lost and gone, blotted in the dark. Suddenly it flickered and back to view. A brief glow touched and faded.
"Look," said one, "the light again. Last night the watchmen's from start and fade from midnight until dawn. Something is happening up there."
"Perhaps the king on the mountain is forging gold," said another. "It's been long since he went north. Is it time the songs began to prove themselves again?"
"What king?" said another with a grim voice. "It's not like it's the marauding, as not it is the marauding Fire the Dragon, the only king of the mountain we've ever known."
"You're always foreboding gloomy things," said the others.
"Anything from floods to poisoned fish. Think of something cheerful."
Then suddenly a great light appeared in the low place in the hills, and the northern end of the lake turned golden. The king beneath the mountain," they shouted. "His wealth is like the sun, his silver like a fountain, his rivers golden run. The river is running gold from the mountain," they cried, and everywhere windows were opening and feet were hurrying. There was once more a tremendous excitement and enthusiasm, but the grim-voiced fellow ran hot-foot to the master.
"The dragon is coming, or I am a fool," he cried. "Cut the bridges! To arms! To arms!"
Then warning trumpets were suddenly sounded and echoed along the rocky shores. The cheering stopped and the joy was turned to dread. So it was the dragon did not find them quite underprepared. Before long, so great was his speed, they could see him as a spark of fire rushing towards them, and growing ever huger and more bright, and not the most foolish doubted the prophecies had gone rather wrong. Still, they had a little time. Every vessel in the town was filled with water, every warrior was armed, every arrow and dart ready, and the bridge to the land was thrown out and destroyed, before the roar of Smaug's terrible approach grew loud, and the lake rippled red as fire breathed the awful beatings of his wings. Amid shrieks and wailings and shouts of men he came over them, swept towards the bridges and was foiled. The bridge was gone, and his enemies were on an island in deep water, too deep and dark and cool for his liking. If he plunged into it, a vapor and steam would rise to cover all the land with mist for days. But the lake was mightier than he would quench him before he could pass through. Roaring, he swept back over the town. A hail of arrows leapt up and snapped and rattled on his scales and jewels, and their shafts fell back, kindled by his breath, burning and hissing into the lake. No fireworks you ever imagined equaled the sights that night. At the twinging of bows and the shrilling of trumpets, the dragon's wrath blazed to its height, till he was blind and mad with it. No one had dared give battle to him for many an age, nor would they have ever dared now, if it had not been for the grim-voiced man. Bard was his name, who ran to and fro, cheering on the archers and urging the master to order them to fight to the last arrow. Fire leaped from the dragon's jaws. He circled for a while high in the air, above them, lighting all the lake. And the trees by the shores shone like copper, and like blood with leaping shadows of dense black at their feet. Then down he swooped straight like through the arrow storm, reckless in his rage, taking no heed to turn his scaly sides towards his foes, seeking only to set their town ablaze. Fire leapt from thatched roofs and wooded beamins as he hurled down past and round again, though all had been drenched with water before he came. Once more the water was flung by 100 hands wherever a spark appeared. Back swirled the dragon. A sweep of his tails and the roof of the great house crumbled and smashed down. Flames unquenchable sprang high into the night. Another swoop and another house and another sprang of fire and fell. And still no arrows hindered Smaug or hurt him more than a fly from the marshes. Already men were jumping into the water on every side. Women and children were being huddled into laden boats in the market pool. Weapons were flung down. There was mourning and weeping, but a little time ago the old songs of mirth had come to become sung about dwarves. Now men cursed their names. The master himself was turning to his great gilded boat, hoping to row away in the confusion and save himself. Soon all the town was to be deserted and burned down onto the surface of the lake. That was the dragon's hope, that they could all get into boats for all he cared. There he would have a fine sport hunting them, or they could stop till they starved. Let them try to get to land, and he would be ready. Soon he would set all shoreland woods ablaze and wither every field and pasture. Just now he was enjoying the sport of town baiting more than he had enjoyed anything for years. But there was still a company of archers that held their ground among the burning houses. Their captain was Bard, grim-voiced and grim-faced, whose friends had accused them of prophesizing floods and poisoned fish, though they knew his worth and courage. He was a descendant in a long line of Girion, Lord of Dale, whose wife and child who escaped down the running river from the ruin long ago. Now he shot with a great yew bow, till all his arrows but one were spent. The flames were near him, his companions were leaving him. He bent his arrow for the last time. Suddenly, out of the dark, something fluttered to his shoulder. He stared, but it was only a old thrush. Unafraid, it perched by his ears and brought him news. Marveling, he found what he could and understand its tongue, for he was of the race of Dale. "Wait, wait," it said to him. "The moon is rising. Look for the hollow of the left breast as he flies and turns above you." And while Bard was paused in wonder, it told him of tidings of the mountain and all of that he had heard. Then Bard drew his bowstring to his ear. The dragon was circling black, flying low, and he came as the moon rose above the eastern shore and silvered his great wings. "Arrow," said the bowman, "Black Arrow, I have saved you to the last. You have never failed me, and always I have recovered you. I had you from my father, and he from of old. If ever you came from the forges of the true king of the mountain, go now and speed well." The dragon swooped once more lower than ever, and he turned and dived down by his belly, glittering white with sparkling fires of gems in the moon. But not in one place. And the great bow twanged. The black arrow sped straight from the string, straight from the hollow by the left breast, where the foreleg was flung wide. In it smote and vanished, barb, shaft, and feather, so fierce was its flight. With a shriek that deafened men, felled trees, and split stone, Smaug shot spouting into the air, turned over, and crashed from on high in ruin. Full on the town he fell. His last throws splintered it to sparks and glades the lake roared in. A vast steam leapt up, while in the sudden dark under the moon there was a hiss, a gushing whirl, and then silence. And that was the end of Smaug, and of Azeroth, but not of Bard. The waxing moon rose higher and higher, and the wind grew loud and cold. It twisted the white fog into bending pillars and hurrying clouds, and it drove off to the west to scatter the tattered shreds over the marshes before Mirkwood. Then the many boats could be seen dotted dark on the surface of the lake, and down the wind came the voices of the people of Esgaroth, lamenting their lost town and goods and ruined houses. But they had really much to be thankful for, had they thought of it, though they could hardly be expected that they should, for just then 3/4 of the people of town had at least escaped alive. Their woods and their fields and pastures and cattle and most of their boats remained undamaged, and the dragon was dead. What that meant, they had not yet realized. They gathered in mournful crowds upon the western shore, shivering in the cold wind, and their first complaints and anger were against the master, who had left the town so soon, while some were still willing to defend it.
He may have been good head for business, especially his own business, some murmured, but he is no good when something serious happens.
And they praised the courage of Bard in his last mighty shot.
If only he had not been killed, they all said, we would make him a king. Bard, the dragon shooter of the line of Girion. Alas, that he is lost.
And in the midst of their talk, a tall figure stepped from the shadows. He was drenched with waters. His black hair hung wet over his face and shoulders, and a fierce light was in his eyes.
Bard is not lost, he cried. He died from Esgaroth when the enemy was slain. I am Bard of the line of Girion. I am the slayer of the dragon.
King Bard! King Bard! They shouted, but the master ground his chattering teeth.
Girion was lord of Dale, not king of Esgaroth, he said. In the lake town we have always elected masters from among the old and the wise, and we have not eluded the rule of mere fighting men. Let King Bard go back to his own kingdom. Dale is now freed by his valor, and nothing hinders his return. And any who wish to go with him, if they prefer the cold stones under the shadow of the mountain to the green shores of the lake, the wise will stay here and hope to rebuild our town and enjoy again in its time of peace of riches.
We will have King Bard, the people near at hand shouted in reply. We've had enough of the old men and the money counters. And the people further off took up the cry. Up the bowmen and down the money bags, till the clamor echoed along the shore.
I am the last man to undervalue the Bard the bowman, said the master wearily,
for Bard now stood close behind him.
He tonight has earned an eminent place in the roll of benefactors of our town, and he is worthy of many perishable songs. But why, O people?
And here the master rose to his feet and spoke very loud and clear.
Why do I get all your blame? For what fault am I to be deposed? For who aroused the dragon in his slumber, might I ask? Who attained of us rich gifts and ample help, and led us to believe the old songs had come true? Who played our soft harps and our pleasant fantasies? What sort of gold they have sent down the river to reward us? Dragon fire and ruin. For whom should we claim our recompense of our damage, and aid our widows and orphans?
As you see, the master had not gotten his position for nothing. The result of his words was that for the moment people quite forgot their idea of a new king, and turned their angry thoughts towards Thorin and their company. Wild and bitter words were shouted from many sides, and some of those who had been sung the old songs loudest were now heard as loudly crying that the dwarves had stirred the dragon against them deliberately.
Fools, said Bard, why waste words and wrath on those unhappy creatures? Doubtless they perished in the fire before Smaug came to us.
Then, even as he was speaking, the thought came into his heart of the fabled treasure of the mountains, lying without guard or owner, and he suddenly fell silent. He thought of the master's words, and of Dale rebuilt, and filled with golden bells, if he could but find the men. At length he spoke again.
"This is no time for angry words, master, or for considering weighty plans of change. There is work to do. I serve you still, though after a while I think again of your words and go north with any who would follow me."
Then he strode off to help in the ordering of the camps and the care of the sick and the wounded. But the master scowled at his back as he went, and remained sitting on the ground. He thought much, but said little, unless it was likely to call loudly for men to bring him fire and food. Now everywhere Bard went he found talk running like fire among the people concerning the vast treasure that was now unguarded. Men spoke of the recompense for all the harm they would soon get from it, the wealth over and to spare from which to buy rich things from the south, and it cheered them greatly in their plight. That was as well, for nights were bitter and miserable. Shelters could be contrived for few. The master had one, and there was little food. Even the master went short. Many took ill of wet and cold and sorrow, and that night and afterwards died, who had escaped uninjured from the ruin of the town, and in those days that followed there was much sickness and great hunger. Meanwhile Bard took the lead, and ordered things as he wished, though always in the master's name, and he had a hard task to govern the people and direct the preparations for their protection and housing. Perhaps most of them would have perished in the winter that now hurried off after autumn, if help had not been to hand. But help came swiftly, for Bard at once had speedy messengers sent up the rivers to the forest, to ask the king of the elves of the wood, and those messengers had found a host already on the move, although it was only the third day after the fall of Smaug. The Elven king had received news from his own messengers, and from the birds that loved his folk, and already knew much of what had happened. Very great indeed was the commotion, and among these things with wings that dwelled on the borders of the desolation of the dragon. The air was filled with circling flocks, and their swift-flying messengers flew here and there across the sky. Above the borders of the forest there was whistling and crying and piping. Far over Mirkwood tidings spread. "Smaug is dead." Leaves rustled and startled ears were lifted. Even the Elven king rode forth with the news had passed right west, right into the pine woods and the misty mountains. Bjorn had heard it in his wooden home, and the goblins were at council in their caves. "That is the last we shall see of Thor and Oakenshield, I fear," said the king. "You would have done better to remain my guest. It is an ill wind all the same," he added, "that blows no one any good." For he, too, had not forgotten the legend of the Relf of Throrer. So it was that Bard's messengers found him now marching, with many spearmen and bowmen, and crows were gathering thick above him, for they thought that war was awakening again, such as had not been seen in those parts for a long age. But the king, when he received the prayers of Bard, had pity, for he was a good lord of a good and kindly people. So turning his march, which had first been directed towards the mountain, he hastened down to the river of the Long Lake. He had not boats or rafts enough for his host, and they were forced to go the slower way by foot. But the great store of goods he sent ahead by water. Still elves are light-footed, and though they were not in these days much used to the marches and treacherous lands between the forest and the lake, their going was swift. Only 5 days after the death of the dragon they came upon the shores, and looked on the ruins of the town. Their welcome was good, and, as it may be expected, the men and their master were ready to make any bargain for their future in return for the Elven king's aid. Their plans were soon made. With the women and children, the old and unfit, the master lay behind, and with him some of the men of crafts and many skilled elves, and they busied themselves felling trees and collecting timber sent down from the forest. Then they set about raising many huts by the shore against the oncoming winter, and under the master's direction they began the planning of a new town, designed more fair and more large than ever before, but not in the same place. They removed them northward higher up in the shore, for as ever after they had a dread of the water where the dragon lay. He would never again return to his golden bed, but it would stretch out as cold as stone, twisted upon the floor of the shallows. There for ages his huge bones could be seen in its calm water, among the piled ruins of the old town. But few dared to cross the cursed spot, and none dared to dive into the shivering water or recover the precious stones that fell from his rotting carcass. But all the men of arms who were still able, and most of the Elven king's array, got ready to march to the north of the mountain. It was thus that in 11 days from the ruin of the town, the head of their host passed the rock gates at the end of the lake, and came into the desolate land.